Surprise! I can walk perfectly fine. And this marriage is officially canceled.
The silence of the pediatric ICU was a lie, a heavy, suffocating blanket designed to smother the screaming reality that the digital clock on the wall was counting down the final hours of his daughter's future. Elias Thorne stood paralyzed by the window, watching the relentless Seattle rain batter the glass, looking less like water and more like gray bars imprisoning him in his own failure. Behind him, the rhythmic, synthetic hiss-click beep of the ventilator was the only thing keeping 6-year-old Leo tethered to this world, a mechanical lifeline that cost more per hour than Elias had earned in the last month. He pressed his forehead against the cold pane, his breath fogging the glass, trying to cool the feverish panic that had been burning in his gut since the specialist in Zurich sent the final notification. "Mr. Thorne, I'm afraid staring at the rain won't change the numbers on the ledger," a soft, sympathetic, but ultimately ruthless voice said from the doorway, pulling him from his trance. Elias turned slowly to face Brenda, the hospital's billing administrator, a woman whose kind eyes were constantly at war with the cruel policies she was forced to enforce. She held a tablet against her chest like a shield, her posture radiating the uncomfortable pity that Elias had grown to despise over the last 6 months of Leo's decline. "I'm waiting on a check from the 4th Street renovation job, Brenda, and once it clears, I can cover the current ICU stay," Elias lied, his voice raspy from days of silence and dehydration, though they both knew the renovation job had stalled weeks ago due to permit issues. Brenda sighed, stepping into the room and glancing at the small, pale figure in the bed, Leo's dark curls fanned out against the sterile white pillow like spilled ink. "It isn't just the room charges anymore, Elias," she said gently, walking over to the monitor as if checking the machines could distract from the blow she was about to deliver. "Dr. Weber called from Zurich this morning. The experimental valve replacement surgery window closes on Friday, and without the $200,000 deposit wired by midnight tonight, they will give her spot to the next child on the international registry." The words hit him with the physical force of a sledgehammer, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him grasping for a defense that didn't exist. Friday was 3 days away, but the wire transfer deadline was tonight, a chronological impossibility that sentenced his daughter to a palliative care unit instead of a recovery room. "You can't let them do that," Elias whispered, stepping between Brenda and the bed as if he could physically fight off the bureaucracy. "She's top of the triage list, her vitals are stable enough for transport, and I just need a little more time to liquidate some assets." "You have no assets left." "Elias," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a whisper to avoid waking the child who was medically induced into slumber. "You sold the house in Ballard, you sold your truck, and you liquidated your 401k to pay for the first round of treatments." Elias looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of carpentry and architecture. Hands that could build skyscrapers and restore Victorians, but couldn't fix the hole in his daughter's heart. He checked his banking app one last time, staring at the number $42.16 mocking him with its pathetic inadequacy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne, but unless a miracle walks through that door in the next 6 hours, I have to release the hold on the Zurich slot," Brenda finished, placing a hand on his shoulder for a brief second before retreating into the hallway, leaving him alone with the beep, the hiss, and the rain. An hour later, Elias walked out of the hospital sliding doors, feeling like a ghost haunting his own life, the cold drizzle soaking through his worn Carhartt jacket instantly. He didn't have a car anymore, having sold it 3 weeks ago, so he walked toward the bus stop, his boots heavy as lead, his mind racing through illegal and impossible scenarios to get the money. He sat on the wet metal bench, head in his hands, wondering if he had the stomach to rob a bank, or if he could beg the construction union for a loan he could never repay. The sound of tires crushing wet gravel pulled him from his dark reverie, and he looked up to see a vehicle that had no business being in this part of town idling at the curb. It was a black Maybach, sleek and predatory, its tinted windows reflecting the gray city like a dark mirror, separating the occupants from the misery of the street. The rear window rolled down with a silent electric hum, revealing a man in the back seat. But before Elias could see a face, the driver's door opened. A chauffeur, built like a linebacker in a bespoke suit, stepped out holding a black umbrella, ignoring the rain as he walked directly toward the bench where Elias sat shivering. "Elias Thorne?" the chauffeur asked, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the city noise, not a question so much as a verification of a target acquired. "Who's asking?" Elias stood up, adrenaline spiking, his fists clenching instinctively as he wondered if this was a debt collector for the medical loans he had defaulted on. "My employer would like a word with you concerning a matter of mutual benefit," the man said, gesturing toward the open rear door of the car where the interior looked warmer than anything Elias had felt in months. "I don't have any money, so if you're here to collect, you can get in line behind the hospital and the IRS," Elias spat, turning to walk away, unwilling to play games with rich tourists. "We know you don't have money, Mr. Thorne," the voice from inside the car spoke, amplified by the wet air, calm and terrifyingly assured. "We know you have $42, we know your daughter has a failing mitral valve, and we know you have exactly 5 hours before Zurich gives her heart to a boy in Munich." Elias froze, the air leaving his lungs, and he spun around to face the car, fear replaced by a sudden, desperate ferocity. He marched to the open door, leaning down to see a man in his 50s with silver hair and a tablet, looking at Elias with the detached interest of an entomologist studying a beetle. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, rain dripping from his nose onto the plush leather interior. "I am merely the messenger," the man said, sliding a thick cream-colored envelope across the seat. "My employer is Serafina Vance, and she has a proposition that will solve your financial problems entirely, provided you are willing to sacrifice a year of your life." The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Serafina Vance was a myth in Seattle, the reclusive heiress to the Vance Holloway technology empire, a woman known as the Ice Queen who hadn't been seen in public since the accident that killed her parents. "Get in, Mr. Thorne," the man said, checking his watch with theatrical impatience. "Unless you prefer the bus, which I believe is running 20 minutes late, much like your payments to the surgeons." Elias looked at the bus stop, then at the warmth of the car, and finally thought of Leo's small hand in his. He climbed into the vehicle, the door sealing shut behind him and cutting off the sound of the rain instantly. The drive to the Vance estate took 40 minutes, winding up the jagged coastline to the cliffs, where the billionaires built their glass fortresses to look down on the ocean. The estate was less a home and more a brutalist monument to isolation, a sprawling structure of steel, concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass perched precariously on the edge of a precipice. The car pulled into a circular driveway that could fit a fleet of trucks, and Elias was ushered out by the chauffeur, guided through massive oak doors into a foyer that smelled of old paper, expensive candles, and absolute silence. "The library," the silver-haired assistant said, pointing down a long hallway lined with marble busts and brooding oil paintings. "She is expecting you." Elias walked down the hall, his wet boots squeaking on the pristine floors, feeling entirely out of his depth, a rough carpenter in a palace of ice. He entered the library, a cavernous room with a roaring fireplace that did little to warm the chill in the air, the walls lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. In the center of the room, facing the fire with her back to him, was a figure seated in a high-tech carbon fiber wheelchair. "Come closer, Mr. Thorne," a voice commanded from the chair, cool and crisp as a winter morning, lacking any of the warmth usually associated with a greeting. "I don't bite unless the situation calls for it." Elias walked around the perimeter of the Persian rug, stepping into her line of sight, and for a moment he forgot about the money, the surgery, and the rain. Serafina Vance was breathtaking in a severe, terrifying way, with raven hair pulled back so tight it pulled at her eyes, which were the color of shattered glaciers. She wore a tailored silk blouse that screamed authority, her legs covered by a cashmere blanket that did nothing to hide the stillness of her lower body. "You know who I am?" she stated, not asking, her gaze dissecting him, taking in the frayed collar of his jacket and the dark circles under his eyes. "I know what the tabloids say," Elias replied, finding his voice and refusing to be cowed by her intensity. "They say you run the biggest tech conglomerate on the West Coast, and that you fire people for sneezing in meetings." "The tabloids are lazy," Serafina said, a flicker of amusement dancing in her eyes before vanishing instantly. "But they are correct about my intolerance for incompetence." She pressed a button on her armrest, and the wheelchair whirred softly, turning her fully toward a mahogany desk where a single file folder lay open. I have a problem, Mr. Thorne, and unlike my engineering problems, this one cannot be solved with code or capital alone, she began, gesturing for him to sit in the stiff chair opposite her. My grandfather, a brilliant but archaic man, inserted a clause in the family trust that controls the voting shares of Vance Holloway. Elias remained standing, too anxious to sit. And what does that have to do with a broke architect? Everything, she snapped, her patience thinning. The clause stipulates that for me to retain the role of CEO and majority shareholder past my 30th birthday, I must be married. If I am single at 30, control of the board reverts to my cousin, Marcus. She said the name Marcus as if it were a disease she was trying to spit out. My birthday is in 2 weeks, she continued, her fingers drumming rhythmically on the armrest of her chair. Marcus is already measuring the curtains in my office, convinced that no man would marry a cripple, his word, not mine, without trying to declare me incompetent to steal my fortune. Elias frowned, the absurdity of the situation washing over him. You're a billionaire. You could hire a model, a sterile corporate husband, anyone. I don't want a partner who wants me, Serafina said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. The men in my circle are sharks. They see this chair and they smell blood, thinking they can marry me, manipulate the board, and take over while I sit helplessly in the corner. She looked up at Elias, her eyes locking onto his with a desperation she tried hard to mask with arrogance. I need a husband who has absolutely no interest in my world. Someone who is so desperate for money that they will sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Play the part of the doting spouse for exactly 365 days, and then disappear. Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he realized exactly what he was, a commodity. You researched me, he accused, his voice low. You looked for the most desperate man in Seattle. I looked for a man who had something to fight for, Serafina corrected, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. I know you were a top architect before you quit to care for your daughter. I know you are honest to a fault. And I know you need exactly $200,000 by tonight. She picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk. This is a contract. We marry, you move in, we attend functions, you pretend to love me, and in return I pay for everything. Elias looked at the paper. It was a check already filled out for the full amount of the surgery, plus travel expenses to Zurich. It was Leo's life, sitting on a piece of paper in front of a woman who looked like she was buying a piece of furniture. I'm not a gigolo, and I'm not an actor, Elias said, his pride flaring up even as his hand twitched toward the check. You are a father, Serafina cut in, her voice sharp as a whip. Don't pretend you have the luxury of pride right now, because we both know that check is the only thing keeping your daughter's heart beating past Friday. The truth of her words silenced him, stripping away his defenses until he was just a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the only lifeline available. I have conditions, Elias said, his voice trembling slightly but his jaw set. Serafina raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, surprised by his resistance. You are in no position to negotiate. Mr. Thorne, Leo lives here with us, Elias stated firmly, leaning his hands on her desk. I'm not shipping her off to a boarding school or a facility. She recovers here with me. Serafina paused, studying his face, looking for deception but finding only fierce paternal protection. Acceptable. The East Wing has been converted into a medical suite already. And secondly, Elias continued, emboldened by her concession, I am not a prop. If we do this, you treat me with respect in front of my daughter and your staff, and we are partners in this lie, not master and servant. For the first time since he entered the room, the ice in Seraphine's eyes seemed to melt, just a fraction, revealing a glimpse of the lonely woman trapped inside the fortress. Agreed, she whispered, pushing the check further toward him. Sign the contract, Elias. And the wire transfer happens before you leave this room. Elias looked at the check, then at the rain battering the window behind her, and finally picked up the pen. He signed his name in heavy, dark strokes, selling his freedom to save his daughter, sealing a pact with the Ice Queen that would change the trajectory of both their lives forever. Welcome to the family, Mr. Thorne, Serafina said, not offering her hand but turning her chair back to the fire. Your daughter's medical team is already en route to the hospital. Go pack your bags. Elias took the check, his hands shaking, and walked out of the library. The weight of the world lifted from his shoulders, only to be replaced by the crushing gravity of the Vance estate. The flight back from Zurich had been a blur of sterile luxury, but the return to the Vance estate felt like landing on a different planet. Leo was alive. Her chest, once a ticking time bomb, now rose and fell with a steady, rhythmic grace that Elias checked obsessively every hour. The surgery had been flawless, paid for with a check signed by a hand that never shook, belonging to a woman who rarely smiled. 2 weeks had passed since they moved in. The estate was vast, a labyrinth of glass corridors and echoing minimalist chambers that felt designed to repel human warmth. Elias and Leo were given the East Wing, a suite larger than any house Elias had ever owned. It was comfortable, undeniably so, but it felt like a gilded cage. Life at the estate was governed by a schedule as rigid as the steel beams holding the roof up. Serafina left for the Vance Holloway headquarters in the city at 6 a.m. sharp, her modified black van swallowing her up before the sun crested the horizon. She returned at 8 p.m., exhausted, her face a mask of porcelain indifference. To the outside world, they were the golden couple. Elias had been paraded in front of cameras twice. Once at a charity gala where he stood beside her chair, his hand resting tentatively on her shoulder as flashes popped like lightning. And once for a coordinated paparazzi shot of them leaving a restaurant. In public, Serafina leaned into him, her eyes softening, her hand gripping his. She was a master performer. But the moment the heavy oak doors of the estate closed, the performance ended. She would wheel herself away without a word, retreating to her study where the lights burned until the early hours of the morning. There was no, "Honey, I'm home." There was only the whir of tires on marble and the click of a locking door. Elias spent his days focusing on Leo. Her recovery was rapid, her color returning, her laughter beginning to bounce off the austere walls. But when Leo napped, Elias roamed the grounds, feeling like a ghost in his own life. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that the first crack appeared. Elias was in the library, sketching absent-mindedly on a notepad. Old habits dying hard when he saw movement through the French doors. The rain had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, golden afternoon. Serafina had come home early, a rarity. She wasn't inside, though. She was on the lower terrace. Elias moved closer to the window, obscured by the heavy velvet drapes. Serafina was sitting in her chair at the edge of the stone patio. 10 feet in front of her, a set of ancient, craggy stone steps led down into the sunken rose garden. The garden was a riot of color crimson, blush, and ivory blooming in defiant beauty against the gray ocean backdrop. Serafina was gripping the wheels of her chair, her knuckles white. She rolled forward an inch, then jerked back. She did it again. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a physical blockade. The steps were steep, uneven, and impossible for her chair to navigate. She sat there for a long time, the wind whipping stray strands of hair across her face. Elias watched as she reached out a hand toward the flowers, grasping nothing but air. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, she slammed her hands down on the armrests of her chair. Her shoulders shook. It wasn't a sob. It was a tremor of pure, unadulterated rage. She spun the chair around aggressively and sped back toward the house, disappearing through a side entrance. Elias stood at the window, looking at the empty terrace and the inaccessible flowers. He looked at his hands that had built skyscrapers, restored heritage homes, and framed roofs. Hands that had felt useless in a hospital room but knew exactly what to do with wood and stone. He checked his watch. Leo was with her tutor for the next 4 hours. Serafina was locked in her study on a conference call. Elias went to the garage. He found the estate manager, a stern man named Holloway. "I need access to the maintenance shed," Elias said. "And I need a lumber delivery, now." The next day, Serafina didn't come home until dusk. The sky was bruising purple over the Pacific as her van pulled up. Elias was waiting in the foyer. He wasn't wearing the stiff suits she had bought for him. He was wearing his old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, covered in a fine layer of sawdust. He smelled of cedar and sweat. Serafina paused as she wheeled into the entry, her eyes narrowing as she took in his appearance. "I wasn't aware we had hired a carpenter," she said coolly. Or did you decide to renovate the guest wing without consulting the board? I didn't touch the house, Elias said, wiping his hands on a rag. I was in the garden. Come with me. I am tired, Elias. I have a board meeting in the morning regarding the merger, and I need to review. It will take 5 minutes, he interrupted. He didn't wait for permission. He walked behind her chair. May I? She stiffened, unused to being handled, but gave a curt nod. 5 minutes. Elias pushed her through the house, out the French doors, and onto the terrace. The air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. He guided her toward the edge of the patio, to the spot where she had sat in frustration the day before. Serafino let out a sharp breath. The jagged stone steps were gone. In their place, or rather floating above them, was a masterpiece of carpentry. It was a ramp, but to call it a ramp felt like an insult. Elias had constructed a sweeping serpentine path made of rich, dark mahogany that matched the estate's trim. It didn't look like a medical necessity. It looked like a sculpture. It curved gently, the gradient perfectly calculated, weaving down through the air to land softly on the gravel path of the rose garden. The railings were sanded satin smooth, glowing under the discreet solar lights he had embedded along the edges. What is this? Serafina whispered. I saw you yesterday, Elias said simply. You wanted to go down there. You built this today? I had some free time. Leo was napping. Serafina didn't speak. She rolled her chair forward, testing the transition from stone to wood. It was seamless. She glided down the curve, the wood humming softly beneath her wheels. Elias walked beside her, not touching the chair, letting her take the lead. She reached the bottom. She was in the center of the garden now, surrounded by the towering bush she had only been able to look at from above for 3 years. She reached out and touched a bloom, a velvety Mr. Lincoln rose, deep red and fragrant. She pulled it toward her face, inhaling deeply. When she looked up at Elias, the mask was gone. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with moisture she refused to let fall. This wasn't in the contract, she said, her voice thick. You aren't paid to do maintenance. I know, Elias said, shoving his hands into his pockets. But I'm an architect, Serafina. I fix space, and everyone deserves to smell the roses. Even billionaire ice queens. A laugh startled her, a genuine, rusty sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him. Is that what they call me? Among other things. Thank you, she said, and the weight of those 2 words hung heavy in the evening air. It's beautiful. Hungry? Elias asked. I made pasta. Not the chef, me. Leo helped. There's flour everywhere. Serafina hesitated, looking at the house where her lonely study waited. Then she looked at the man standing amidst the roses, sawdust in his hair, looking at her not with pity, but with a quiet, steady pride. I suppose, she said, I could eat. Dinner was eaten on the terrace under the heat lamps. Leo chattered endlessly about her new Lego set, oblivious to the tension shifting between the 2 adults. Serafina was surprisingly good with her. She listened intently to Leo's explanation of dragon dynamics, nodding solemnly. After Leo was taken to bed by the nanny, Elias poured 2 glasses of wine. The silence that settled wasn't the icy void of the previous weeks. It was companionable. Why? Serafina asked suddenly, swirling the dark red liquid in her glass. Why what? The ramp? No, why are you... Nice? You have the money? Your daughter is safe. You could just ride out the year, collect your 5 million, and leave. Most men would. Elias took a sip of wine. I'm not most men. And despite the attitude, I don't think you're as cold as you pretend to be. I see how you look at Leo. Serafina looked away, toward the dark ocean. Weakness is a liability in my world, Elias. If I show softness, they strike. Who is they? My cousin, Marcus. She spat the name. He sits on the board. He's the one pushing the marriage clause. He's been trying to oust me since the accident. The accident? Elias echoed gently. 3 years ago? A car crash, she said, her voice devoid of emotion, reciting facts. Brake failure on a rainy night. My parents died instantly. I woke up 3 weeks later, T-12 spinal injury, paralyzed from the waist down. She took a large gulp of wine. Marcus visited me in the ICU. He didn't bring flowers. He brought legal papers trying to get me to sign over power of attorney. He told the board I was brain damaged. When I came back to work in the chair, he started the whisper campaign. He calls me the broken doll behind closed doors. He says a company that builds the future couldn't be led by someone who couldn't even walk. Elias felt a surge of anger so hot it surprised him. He set his glass down hard. He sounds like a coward. He is, Serafina agreed. But he is a powerful one. He thinks that if I am forced to marry, I'll pick a trophy husband who he can manipulate. Or I'll refuse and the trust strips me of my voting rights. Either way, he wins. He didn't count on you picking a stubborn contractor with nothing to lose, Elias said. Serafina turned to him, her eyes searching his face. No, he didn't. For a moment, the distance between them vanished. The air charged with something electric, something that terrified Elias because it felt real. He wasn't supposed to fall for the client. He wasn't supposed to want to reach out and smooth the worry line from her forehead. I should go, Serafina said abruptly, pulling back as if she had touched a hot stove. I have emails. Serafina, Elias said. She paused, her hand on the joystick of her chair. You're not broken, he said firmly. She didn't look back, but he saw her shoulders hunch slightly before she sped away into the safety of the house. The bond between them grew in the following days, fragile but undeniable. Serafina started coming home earlier. They developed a routine dinner together, sometimes a game of chess, which she won ruthlessly. But there was still a part of her she kept locked away. It was 3 weeks before the wedding. Elias couldn't sleep. The nightmares of the hospital monitors still haunted him. He got up at 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. The house was silent, a tomb of shadows. As he walked past the west wing, an area he was told was storage, he heard a sound, thud, then a groan. A guttural, strained sound of exertion and pain. Elias froze. He crept closer to the double doors. Clank, hiss. It sounded like machinery. He pushed the door open a crack. The room wasn't storage. It was a state-of-the-art rehabilitation gym. Mirrors lined the walls. Parallel bars stood in the center, and there was Serafina. She wasn't in her chair. She was strapped into a harness suspended from the ceiling, her body drenched in sweat, her hair matted to her forehead. She was gripping the parallel bars with trembling arms. Come on, she hissed at herself, her voice raw. Move, damn it! Elias watched, breath held, as she tried to drag her right leg forward. It was a chaotic, shaking movement. She screamed in frustration, her muscles spasming and her grip slipped. She fell. The harness caught her before she hit the floor, but she swung there, sobbing, beating her fists against her paralyzed thighs. Useless! She screamed at her legs. Wake up. Elias's instinct was to rush in, to help her, to lift her up. He took a step forward, his hand on the door handle. But he stopped. He remembered what she had said about Marcus. They see this chair and see weakness. She wasn't just exercising. She was fighting. She was waging a private war against her own body, refusing to accept the diagnosis, refusing to be the broken doll. If he went in there now, if he saw her like this hanging, crying, vulnerable, it wouldn't be comfort. It would be humiliation. It would confirm her worst fear, that she was something to be pitied. He watched as she wiped her face with her forearm, took a ragged breath and gripped the bars again. Again, she whispered. One more time, and she pulled herself up. She didn't stop. She didn't quit. Elias slowly, silently pulled the door closed. He leaned against the wall in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had thought he was marrying a cold businesswoman. He had thought he was marrying a victim of circumstance. He was wrong. He was marrying a warrior. He walked back to his room. The image of her trembling determination burned into his retinas. The contract was a lie. The money didn't matter anymore. Marcus Vance had no idea what was coming for him. Because Elias knew one thing for certain now, he wasn't just playing a part. He was going to stand by her. And if she fell, he would be there not to pick her up, but to make sure no one else dared to keep her down. The wedding was in 2 weeks. And for the first time, Elias Thorne couldn't wait to say, I do. The week leading up to the wedding was a masterclass in organized chaos. A spectacle that turned the austere Vance estate into a staging ground for a royal coronation. The silence that Elias had grown fond of, the quiet hum of the ocean and the wind in the fir trees, was replaced by the screech of delivery trucks, the shouting of florists, and the endless, invasive clicking of cameras. To the outside world, this was the fairy tale of the century, the reclusive billionaire and the rugged architect. But inside the glass walls, the atmosphere was suffocating. Elias felt less like a groom and more like a prop being polished for a high-stakes theatrical production. He was shuffled from room to room, measured by tailors who spoke in hushed French, and briefed by public relations managers on how to stand next to Seraphine's wheelchair to optimize the visual symmetry of the photographs. Through it all, Serafina had vanished. The tentative warmth they had cultivated in the rose garden, the shared glasses of wine, the quiet games of chess, it all evaporated as the deadline loomed. She retreated behind the walls of her boardroom and the locked doors of the West Wing. Elias would see her only in passing, her face pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. She looked like a soldier preparing for a battle she expected to lose, not a bride preparing for a wedding. The disconnect gnawed at Elias. He wandered the decorated halls, feeling like an imposter in his own life. 2 days before the ceremony, the tension reached a breaking point. Elias was sent into downtown Seattle for a final fitting of his wedding band, a platinum loop that cost more than his father's entire lifetime of earnings. He sat in the back of the black sedan, watching the rain streak the windows, feeling a distinct urge to open the door and run. As he exited the high-security jeweler, the heavy gray sky finally opened up, drenching the city in a cold downpour. He signaled for his driver, but instead of the familiar black sedan, a silver Bentley Continental pulled smoothly to the curb, splashing water onto Elias's boots. The rear window hummed down. "Mr. Thorne," a smooth, cultured voice called out. "You look like a man who could use a dry seat and a moment of clarity." Elias stiffened. He recognized the face instantly from the photo Serafina had shown him. It was Marcus Vance. Seraphine's cousin was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. He was impeccably groomed, his suit sharp enough to cut glass, but his eyes were flat and predatory. He didn't look like a businessman, he looked like a shark in a silk tie. "I have nothing to say to you, Marcus," Elias said, gripping the ring box in his pocket. "On the contrary," Marcus smiled, a gesture that showed too many teeth. "I think you have questions. Questions about your future. Questions about why my dear cousin has been locking herself in her office with her lawyers for the past 3 nights. Get in, Elias, 2 blocks. That's all I ask." Curiosity, cold and sharp, pierced Elias's chest. He hesitated, then opened the door and slid into the leather-scented interior. "Drive," Marcus commanded the driver, then turned to Elias. "I'll get straight to the point, Mr. Thorne. I know about the contract. I know about the debt. I know about the pediatric ICU bills and the $42 you had in your checking account the day you met her." Elias stared straight ahead. "It's a legal arrangement. It's no secret. The arrangement is real," Marcus agreed, pouring himself a drink from a crystal decanter built into the armrest. "But the payout? The $5 million she promised you at the end of the year? That, I'm afraid, is a fiction." Elias turned to look at him. "What are you talking about?" "Serafina is brilliant, Elias. You have to give her that," Marcus said, swirling the amber liquid. "She knows that simply divorcing you after a year would entitle you to a settlement. It's messy, it's expensive. And Serafina hates waste." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. It was a copy of the prenuptial agreement, the same one Elias had signed. "Did you read Clause 14, subsection B?" Marcus asked gently. "I read the contract," Elias lied. In truth, he had skimmed the dense legalese, blinded by the desperate need to save Leo. "Clause 14 is the good faith stipulation," Marcus explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It states that if the marriage is determined to have been entered into under fraudulent financial pretenses without the intent of a genuine marital union, the party of the first part that Serafina reserves the right to file for an annulment, not a divorce." Elias felt the blood drain from his face. And an annulment erases the marriage legally," Marcus said, snapping his fingers. "Poof, it never happened. No marriage means no division of assets, no settlement. No $5 million? She secures the board vote this Saturday, she keeps her company, and then next week, she files for annulment based on the fact that you married her for money. She has the paper trail to prove it. She cuts you loose with nothing, Elias. You are a disposable asset. The car was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the rain drumming on the roof. Elias felt sick. It made too much sense. The distance she kept, the way she hid her recovery. The way she looked at him sometimes not with affection, but with calculation. I wrote this contract when I thought you were just a gold digger, she had said. Why tell me this? Elias asked, his voice rough. Because I despise her methods, Marcus lied smoothly. And because I want to win. If she marries you, she keeps the board. If she is left at the altar, she is humiliated. The board will see her as unstable, unlovable, unfit to lead. I take control. Marcus reached into his breast pocket again. This time he pulled out a checkbook. He uncapped a fountain pen and scribbled a number with a flourish. He tore the check out and held it up. $10 million, Marcus said. Cashier's check? Verified funds? I can have it in an offshore account for you within the hour. Elias looked at the slip of paper. The number was staggering. It was freedom. It was a house for Leo, the best schools, the best doctors, a life where he never had to worry about the price of milk again. All you have to do, Marcus whispered, leaning in close, is disappear, pack your bags tonight, take your daughter, get on a plane, leave her standing there on Saturday. Let the world see the Ice Queen for what she really is, a woman no one can love. Elias looked at the check, then at Marcus's smug face. You want me to destroy her? I want you to save yourself, Marcus corrected. She is playing you, Elias. She is using your daughter's life as leverage to secure her stock options. I'm offering you a way out. A profitable way out. The car pulled to the curb a block from the estate. Think about it, Marcus said, tucking the check into Elias's jacket pocket. The offer expires when the wedding march starts. Don't be a fool, architect. Don't build a life on a foundation that's rigged to explode. Elias stumbled out of the car into the rain. He watched the Bentley drive away, the taillights fading into the mist like red eyes. He touched the pocket where the check lay burning against his chest. He stormed into the estate, soaking wet, ignoring the shocked gasps of the florists arranging hydrangeas in the foyer. He went straight to his room, tore open his safe, and ripped out his copy of the contract. He sat on the floor, frantic, scanning the pages. There it was. Clause 14 reserves the right to seek annulment, rendering all prior financial agreements null and void. It was real. It was a trapdoor. A cold rage settled over him. He thought of the ramp he had built. He thought of the nights they had spent talking. He thought of how Leo had drawn a picture of the three of them, Elias, Leo, and Serafina holding hands. Had it all been a game to her? Was he just a pawn to be sacrificed so she could keep her crown? He needed to look her in the eye. He marched to the west wing. It was late, past midnight. The house was quiet. He found her in her study, the door ajar. Serafina was sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She held a glass of whiskey, her hand trembling slightly. She looked small, fragile, consumed by the shadows of the room. Elias pushed the door open, the heavy wood slamming against the wall. Serafina jumped, spinning her chair around. Her eyes widened when she saw him, wet, disheveled, and furious. Elias? She asked. What happened? I met your cousin today, Elias said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He walked toward her, pulling the check from his pocket and slamming it onto her desk. He made me a very interesting offer. Serafina looked at the check. She didn't pick it up. Her face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the CEO. 10 million, she said flatly. Marcus always did believe that everyone has a price. He also told me about Clause 14, Elias said, leaning over the desk, invading her space. He told me about the annulment loophole. He told me that once you get your vote on Saturday, you plan to cut me loose with nothing. Is it true? Serafina didn't flinch. She met his gaze with icy calm. Is what true? That the clause exists? Yes, it does. And do you plan to use it? Elias demanded. Am I just an asset to be liquidated? Did you lie to me, Serafina? Was the garden, the dinner, the time with Leo, was any of it real, or was it just asset management? Serafina set her glass down. Her jaw tightened. I wrote that contract 3 months ago, Elias, before I knew you. I wrote it to protect my grandfather's legacy from gold diggers and corporate spies. I have enemies. Marcus is proof of that. But you didn't change it, Elias countered, his voice cracking. You saw me care for you. You saw me build a life here. And you left the trapdoor open. Why? Because I need to be sure. She snapped, her voice rising to match his. Because everyone leaves, Elias. Everyone. My parents left. My friends left when the accident happened. The board wants me gone. Marcus wants me dead. How can I trust that you won't turn on me the moment the check clears? How can I trust that you aren't just another man waiting to cash in on the cripple? The word hung in the air, ugly and raw. I am not them, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I turned down $10 million today, Serafina. I came here to you. Doesn't that count for anything? Serafina looked at him, her eyes searching his face, warring between hope and fear. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to tear up the contract right there. But 3 years of betrayal had built a fortress around her heart that wasn't easily breached. If you turned it down, she said softly, then you have nothing to worry about. That's not enough, Elias said, shaking his head. I need you to promise me. Look me in the eye and tell me we are partners. Tell me you won't use that clause. Serafina hesitated. It was the moment of truth, but the fear paralyzed her. If she promised him security, would he stay for the security, or would he stay for her? She needed to know. She needed to know if he would stand by her even if there was no net, even if he thought he might fall. I can't promise that, Elias, she said, her voice trembling but firm. The contract stands as written. Elias stared at her, stunned. The rejection hit him harder than the rain. You're serious? You're actually telling me that I have to walk down that aisle blind? Trusting a woman who won't trust me back? I am telling you that faith is a risk, she said, turning her chair away from him, back to the fire. If you think I am a monster, Elias, if you think I am capable of doing that to you and Leo, then take Marcus's money, take it and go. I won't stop you. Elias stood there for a long, agonizing minute. He looked at the back of her wheelchair. He looked at the check on the desk. Maybe I will, he whispered. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the check on the desk and the door wide open. The night was a blur of sleepless torment. Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his suitcase open. He packed his shirts. He packed his tools. He packed Leo's favorite storybooks. He looked at his daughter, sleeping peacefully in the next room. If he left now, she was set for life. Marcus's money was dirty, but it spent the same. He could take her to Switzerland himself. He could buy a farmhouse in Tuscany. He could save her. But then he looked at the tuxedo hanging on the wardrobe door. He remembered Serafina in the gym. He remembered the sound of her body hitting the floor, and the sound of her pulling herself back up. Again, one more time. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman who had been broken by the world and had rebuilt herself out of steel and silence. She wasn't pushing him away because she hated him. She was pushing him away because she was terrified that he was just another illusion. She was testing him. Just as Marcus had tested him with greed, she was testing him with fear. If he left, Marcus won. If he left, he proved her right that everyone leaves, that she was unlovable. Elias closed his eyes. He realized he wasn't afraid of poverty. He had been poor his whole life. He was afraid of becoming a coward. He stood up. He walked over to the suitcase. He took the clothes out and put them back in the drawers. He zipped the empty bag shut and shoved it into the back of the closet. He wasn't staying for the money. He wasn't staying for the contract. He was staying because he was the architect, and he didn't abandon a structure just because the foundation was shaking. He reinforced it. He sat in the chair by the window and watched the sun rise over the gray ocean, waiting for the wedding march. The ballroom was a sea of murmurs. 300 of the world's wealthiest people sat in rows of velvet chairs, checking their watches. The air smelled of lilac and expensive perfume. Elias stood at the altar. He was pale, but he was standing still as a stone. Marcus sat in the front row, checking the time. He caught Elias's eye and raised an eyebrow, a silent question. Did you take it? Are you running? Elias stared right through him. Marcus's smile faltered. He realized with a dawning horror that Elias wasn't going anywhere. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room groaned open. The string quartet began to play. The crowd stood. Serafina appeared. She sat in her chair, a vision in white silk and lace. She looked terrified. Her hands gripped a bouquet of white roses so tightly the stems were snapping. Her father's old business partner pushed her slowly down the aisle. We're Click, whir. She looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw the pity, she saw the judgment, then she looked at the altar. She looked for the empty space where the groom should have been. But he was there. Elias was waiting. He wasn't looking at the exit. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at her. And in his eyes there was no fear. There was only a quiet, steady resolve. She reached the altar, the chair locked into place, the music faded. The priest cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," the priest began. Seraphine's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Marcus, who was glaring at her with pure venom. She looked at Elias, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. She took a deep breath. The air felt thin. The moment hung suspended in time, fragile as glass. "Stop," she whispered. The priest paused. The room went deadly silent. "Miss Vance?" "Stop the ceremony," she said, her voice louder this time. Trembling with an emotion that the board of directors couldn't quantify, she handed her bouquet to her maid of honor. She placed her hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. "Serafina?" Elias stepped forward, concern etching his brow. She looked up at him, tears welled in her eyes, hot and fast. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice amplified by the microphone, cracking with relief. "You didn't take the money. You stayed." "I told you," Elias said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. Then I have to meet you halfway," she said. She turned her gaze to the crowd, her eyes finding Marcus in the front row. The fire that had been smoldering in her for 3 years suddenly roared to life. "I have spent 3 years sitting in this chair," she announced, her voice ringing through the hall. "Listening to you whisper, listening to you plan my obsolescence." She gripped the armrests. Her knuckles turned white. She closed her eyes and summoned the ghost of the muscles she had tortured back to life in the dark. She leaned forward. "Serafina, don't!" Marcus hissed, standing up. "You'll fall. Watch me," she said. And with a cry that tore through the silence of the room, Serafina Vance began to push. The ballroom was a vacuum of silence, a grand, gilded chamber where 300 breaths were collectively held. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic, thudding rhythm of Elelias's own heart. Serafina Vance had said, "Stop!" The word hung in the air, sharp and final, severing the ritualistic drone of the priest. Beside the altar, the string quartet lowered their bows, confused. In the front row, Marcus Vance stood halfway out of his seat, his face a rictus of panic and anticipation. He looked like a man watching a demolition, unsure if the building would fall on his enemy or himself. Serafina sat in the center of the dais, the focal point of a room designed to intimidate. Her knuckles were white against the black carbon fiber of her armrests. The lace of her veil trembled, betraying the seismic struggle happening beneath the silk of her dress. "Serafina?" Elias stepped closer, his voice low, intimate despite the crowd. "Talk to me." She didn't look at him. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She was breathing in sharp, rhythmic bursts, the same breathing he had heard through the door of the gym, in out, brace. "I need," she whispered, her voice strained, beads of sweat breaking out along her hairline. "I need a moment." "Take it," Elias said, positioning himself slightly between her and the crowd, shielding her from the predatory glare of the cameras. "Take all of them, Miss Vance," the priest stammered, looking nervously at the board of directors in the second row. Shall we pause the ceremony? Is there a medical issue?" "No," Serafina said. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't filled with tears anymore. They were filled with iron. She moved her hands from the armrests to her knees. She shifted her weight forward. A collective gasp rippled through the room. It sounded like a sudden intake of air before a scream. A wine glass shattered somewhere in the back, dropped by a stunned waiter. What is she doing?" Someone whispered loudly. "Don't be a fool, Serafina," Marcus hissed, his voice carrying in the silence. "Stop this spectacle. You're unwell." Serafina ignored him. She ignored the murmurs. She ignored the terrifying probability of failure. She focused on the sensation she had fought for 3 years to reclaim. The feeling of the floor beneath her solace. She locked her jaw. Every muscle in her upper body coiled. She visualized the nerve endings in her spine, The damaged pathways she had spent thousands of hours coaxing back to life in the dark, sweating and screaming alone in the West Wing. Push, with a guttural cry that was half sob, half roar, Serafina Vance engaged her core. Her arms shook violently as she pushed off the chair. Her legs, atrophied but awakening, quivered under the sudden demand of gravity. Elias's hands twitched. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to grab her, to hoist her up, to save her, but he saw the fire in her eyes. This wasn't a request for help. This was a declaration of independence. If he touched her now, he would diminish her. So he stood like a statue, his hands hovering inches away, a silent safety net. Up, she rose. Inch by agonizing inch. The silk of her dress cascaded down, straightening, revealing the length of her body. She swayed dangerously to the left. The crowd screamed. Elias leaned in, ready to catch her, but she corrected. She slammed her right foot down, finding her balance. She locked her knees, she released the chair, and then she stood. For the first time in 3 years, Serafina Vance was upright. She was taller than Elias had realized. She stood amidst the flowers and the candlelight, swaying slightly like a sapling in a storm, but she was vertical. The room was paralyzed. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if a law of physics had been broken before their eyes. Serafina reached out and adjusted the microphone stand, pulling it up to meet her new height. The feedback screech made the crowd flinch, breaking the trance. She looked out at the sea of faces. She saw the shock. She saw the awe. And in the front row, she saw Marcus, who had collapsed back into his seat, his face drained of blood, looking at her as if she were a ghost. "I stood," Serafina said, her voice shaking with exertion but amplified to a boom by the speakers, "because I was tired of looking up at people who looked down on me." She took a ragged breath, fighting the exhaustion that was already clawing at her muscles. "For 3 years," she continued, sweeping her gaze across the board of directors, "you have whispered, you have held emergency meetings. You have debated whether a woman who cannot walk can lead a company that builds the future. You called me the broken doll." She pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "You," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You told me my mind was as broken as my spine. You tried to steal my legacy while I was in a hospital bed. You tried to bribe my fiancé to leave me here alone, to humiliate me so you could seize power." The crowd turned on Marcus instantly. The whispers turned to accusations. Marcus shrank into his collar, ruined. "I have been walking in secret for months," Serafina revealed, her legs shaking harder now. "I could have walked down this aisle, but I chose the chair. Because I needed to know." She turned her head, looking at Elias. Her expression softened, the ice melting into something raw and terrified. "I needed to know who was loyal to the CEO and who was loyal to the woman. I needed to know who would stand by the chair and who was just waiting for it to break." She took a wobbly step toward him. Elias closed the distance instantly, his hands finding her waist, taking some of the weight without taking her dignity. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, the microphone picking up her ragged breathing. "You didn't take the money, Elias," she whispered into his tuxedo lapel, her voice breaking. "Marcus offered you $10 million to leave me. And you're still here." "I don't want his money," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "I never wanted the money, Serafina. I just wanted you to trust me." "I do," she sobbed, the adrenaline finally giving way to the overwhelming emotional release. "The contract, the prenuptial, it's void. I tore it up this morning." She pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup, looking more beautiful to him than she ever had in the glossy magazines. "I don't want a placeholder, Elias. I don't want an employee I have to buy. I want a husband." She gripped his lapels, her legs failing, her body sliding down. "I want a father for the children we might have. I want the man who built me a ramp so I could smell the roses." "I've got you," Elias whispered, tightening his grip, holding her up. "I've got you, Serafina. I can't stand anymore," she gasped, her strength gone. "You don't have to," Elias said. With one fluid motion, Elias swept her up into his arms, lifting her bridal style. Her dress pulled toward the floor, her arms wrapped instinctively around his neck. He turned to the stunned crowd. He looked at the priest, who was standing with his mouth open. "We'll take those vows now," Elias said, a grin breaking across his face. "If you don't mind," the room erupted. It wasn't polite applause, it was a roar. People were standing on chairs. The board members were clapping, even the string quartet was cheering. In the front row, a small figure in a flower girl dress scrambled over the velvet rope. Leo ran up the steps, dodging the train of Seraphine's dress. "Daddy!" "Sira," she yelled, latching onto Elias's leg. "You did it!" "You stood up like a superhero." Serafina looked down from Elias's arms, laughing through her tears. She reached down and squeezed Leo's hand. "I did, Leo, but your daddy caught me." The priest, recovering his wits, rushed through the vows, shouting to be heard over the cheering crowd. When he said, "You may kiss the bride," Elias didn't hesitate. He kissed her with a passion that shattered the last remnants of the business arrangement. It was a kiss of promise, of relief, and of absolute victory. As they broke apart, breathless, Serafina looked over Elias's shoulder at Marcus. He was being escorted out by security men who worked for her. She looked back at her husband. "Take me home, Elias." "What about the reception?" he asked, smiling. "Do we get cake?" Leo asked loudly, tugging on his pant leg. Serafina laughed, a bright, joyous sound that filled the vaulted ceiling. "Yes, Leo, we get cake. We get the house. We get everything." Elias carried her down the aisle, Leo skipping beside them. They walked past the empty wheelchair, leaving it behind like a chrysalis. They walked out into the cool Seattle air, where the rain had finally stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Epilogue 6 months later. The Vance estate was unrecognizable. The austere, museum-like quality of the main hall had been replaced by the chaotic warmth of a lived-in home. A massive blanket fort, constructed by an architect and a 6-year-old, dominated the living room. Elias stood on the terrace, watching the sunset bleed orange and purple into the Pacific. He held a mug of coffee, the steam curling in the cool evening air. He heard the sound behind him, clack, step, clack, step. He turned to see Serafina walking toward him. She used a sleek, silver cane now, moving with a slow but determined grace. The wheelchair was still in the house, used for long days or when fatigue set in, but the fear of it was gone. She reached the railing and leaned against him, sighing contentedly. "Tough day?" Elias asked, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Long day," she corrected. "The board is finally stabilized. Our stock is up 12% since Marcus was removed. Have you heard from him?" "His lawyers called," Serafina said with a wicked smirk. "He's trying to sue for wrongful termination. But since my husband, the brilliant architect, found those structural violations in Marcus's real estate portfolio, let us just say Marcus is too busy with building inspectors and federal fines to bother us." Elias chuckled, kissing the top of her head. "I just read the blueprint, Sira. He's the one who cut corners." "You protect us," she said softly, turning to face him. She rested her weight against his hip, discarding the cane for a moment to place both hands on his chest. "I never thank you properly. For refusing the 10 million, you thank me every day," Elias said, "by being here, by loving Leo." "Speaking of Leo," Serafina said, glancing back at the house. "She asked me today if she could call me Mom." Elias froze. He looked at her, searching for hesitation, but finding only joy. "What did you say?" "I told her that nothing would make me happier," Serafina whispered, her eyes shining. "We're adopting her formally next month. The papers are ready." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He pulled her close, burying his face in her neck, breathing in her scent of roses and rain. They had started with a desperate contract, 2 broken people trying to survive. And somehow, amidst the wreckage, they had built something unbreakable. "You know," Elias murmured against her skin, "I still owe you a honeymoon." "We never went." "I don't need a honeymoon," Serafina said, looking at the toy-strewn living room and the man holding her. "I'm already exactly where I want to be." Inside, Leo laughed at a cartoon, the sound echoing through the house. Outside, the ocean roared, timeless and vast. And on the terrace, Serafina Vance, the woman who learned to stand, leaned into Elias Thorne, the man who taught her she didn't have to do it alone. Everything was perfect.